Hi, I'm Linda from Coastal Canine, and this is the second video in our series on separation-related behaviours. Now, in the first video, we looked at the science behind attachment, why it's so important when we first bring a puppy home, and some simple prevention exercises that can help build confidence and independence from the very beginning. But I also promised we'd come back and look at a different question. And that is, what if your dog is already struggling when you leave the house? Now, before we get started, I also want to give credit to where much of today's information comes from. As mentioned in part 1, this series is based on research and teaching from one of the course providers I've been really fortunate enough to learn from. And I think I've been learning from them for almost 10 years now, and that is the School of Canine Science. Their work alongside my own experience in practice has helped shape the way I now assess and work with dogs experiencing separation-related behaviours. Now, I don't like saying, but one of the biggest mistakes I see is people assuming that every dog with separation issues is struggling for exactly the same reason. And as a result, they're often given exactly the same advice. But the problem is that dogs can struggle with being left alone for very different reasons, which means the training plan should reflect the individual's dog or the individual dog, rather than taking that one-size-fits-all approach that I often see. Now, recent research looking at more than 2,700 dogs found that separation-related behaviours don't all fit into a single category. Instead, researchers identified several different patterns, suggesting there are different underlying reasons why dogs may find being left alone difficult. Now, that doesn't mean every dog fits neatly into one box. Many dogs show characteristics of more than one group, and every dog still needs to be assessed as an individual. Now, what this research does tell us is something I think every owner should know. Before any training plan begins, a good behaviourist should spend time working out what's actually driving your dog's behaviour. They're not just looking at what your dog is doing. They're trying to understand why they're doing it. That's why I'd be cautious of anyone who arrives with exactly the same training plan for every dog with separation issues. The assessment should always come first. Now, the research identified 4 broad groups of dogs, and although I use slightly different names within my own model, the principles fit remarkably well with what I see in practice. So let's look at those 4 groups and, more importantly, what I'd expect a good behaviourist to be looking for during an assessment. So let's start with the first group. Now, the researchers described this as dogs that become frustrated when someone leaves the home. Within my own model, I tend to think of these dogs as showing an in-group, out-group response. Now, what I mean by that is the dog isn't necessarily worried about being left alone. Instead, they become frustrated because someone from their social group is leaving. Now, one of the first things I'd expect a good behaviourist to establish is exactly what triggers that response. Is it one particular person leaving, or does the dog react when everybody leaves? Does the dog become unsettled before the person has even reached the door, or only once they have gone? Those details really matter because they help us understand what's driving the behaviour. Now, in my own experience, I tend to see the pattern more commonly, possibly in breeds that have been selectively bred to keep groups together, such as many of the herding breeds. Of course, that doesn't mean every herding breed will show this behaviour or other breeds won't, but understanding what the dog was originally bred to do can sometimes help explain why they're responding in that way. Now, These dogs can become highly aroused when somebody leaves. You might see barking, chasing, grabbing at clothes, or even redirected behaviours such as biting furniture or other objects nearby. Sometimes people assume the dog is simply being naughty, but a good behaviourist will look beyond the behaviour itself and ask, why is it actually happening? Okay, so the second group is not even quite different, very different. These are dogs that appear to become frustrated because they want to get out, or they struggle with confinement itself. So again, I'd expect a good behaviourist to investigate this rather than making assumptions. For example, does the dog also struggle if they're behind a baby gate while you're still at home? Do they become frustrated if they're shut in another room or confined to a crate, even though you are still in the house? Now, those questions help us work out whether the dog is really distressed because you've left, or whether frustration around barriers and confinement is playing a much bigger role. Now, these dogs are often quite confident in many areas of life. They simply don't cope well when access is restricted, and frustration tolerance may be something that needs developing. It's also important to consider whether the dog's physical and mental needs are truly being met before we start assuming the problem is purely separation related. Now, already you can hopefully see why one-size-fits-all advice doesn't work. Now, although both of these dogs may bark, scratch at doors, or possibly become destructive when left alone, the reason behind those behaviours may be completely different. If the underlying cause is different, then the training plan definitely needs to be different too. Now, in the next part, we'll look at the remaining two groups, including the dogs that are genuinely anxious about being left alone, and why understanding that difference is so important when deciding how to help them. Now, the third group identified by the researchers is probably what many people think of when they hear the term separation anxiety. Now, these dogs appear to be genuinely worried about being left alone, rather than frustration being the driving force. The underlying emotion here is much more likely to be anxiety. Now, one of the things highlighted within the research was that dogs in this group were much more likely to toilet in the house when left alone, and that's something I commonly see in practice too. Now, it's important to remember that this isn't the dog being spiteful or trying to get back at their owners. If a dog is genuinely distressed, toileting can simply be part of the emotional response. Now, the researchers also discussed insecure attachment, suggesting that dogs with less secure attachment relationships may be at a greater risk of developing this type of separation-related behaviour. Now, I think that's an interesting point, although my own experience makes me wonder whether it can also work the other way around. Dogs that are naturally more anxious may find it harder to develop secure attachments in the first place. Either way, these are often the dogs that I see benefiting most from a combination of modification and, where appropriate, support from their veterinary surgeon. Now, the fourth group was described as a boredom group, although the researchers themselves pointed out that it was really a catch-all category for dogs that didn't fit neatly into the other three boxes. Now, some of these dogs may simply have had very little opportunity to learn that being left alone is safe. Others may not have been having their physical or mental or behavioural needs fully met. while some show a mixture of characteristics that don't clearly fit into any single group. Now, I think that's an important point because it reminds us not to jump to conclusions. Just because a dog becomes destructive or vocal when left alone doesn't automatically mean they're anxious. Sometimes the behaviour is being driven by other factors, and that's exactly why understanding the individual dog is so important before deciding on that dog's training plan. Now, with those 4 groups in mind, let's now look at some of the foundations that can help many dogs regardless of which category they may fit into. The first thing I'd look at is your dog's daily routine, particularly the timing of their walk. Now, many owners think the best thing to do is take their dog for a walk immediately before leaving the house. Sounds like common sense because we often think a tired dog is more likely to settle. However, after exercise, dogs need time to come back down, just like us. They've had a rush of excitement. Their body temperature is definitely higher and their arousal levels are often elevated. If they've also experienced maybe exciting or worrying things on that walk, those emotions may still be with them when you leave as well. I'd much rather see the walk finished around an hour before you're planning to go out. Giving your dog time to relax before being left alone, I think, is really important. Now, the second thing I'd recommend is a short training session. It doesn't need to be complicated. In fact, I'd encourage you to choose exercises that both you and your dog enjoy and are likely to succeed with. Simple behaviours such as maybe a chin target, a nose target, going to bed, they're all great choices. Not only does this provide mental stimulation, but researchers also suggest that training together can strengthen the relationship between you and your dog. Now, the third is to give your dog something appropriate to do independently while you're still in the house, getting ready to leave. Now, that might be you stuff a Kong, you might even stuff a Kong and freeze it. A simple treasure hunt. The most important part is it's not what enrichment you choose. It's about helping your dog learn that they can happily spend short periods doing something without you before you actually leave the house. Now, the fourth is to take an honest look at whether your dog's everyday needs are really being met. And I think this is a big one. Are they getting appropriate physical exercise for the breed that you have? Are they getting enough mental stimulation for the breed that you have? Do they have opportunities to sniff, explore, problem solve, simply behave like a dog? If those needs aren't being met consistently, they can become part of the overall picture, particularly for dogs where frustration plays a role. The fifth is to help your dog build frustration, tolerance, and independence in everyday life. Small exercises that encourage your dog to cope with short periods of waiting, being settled away from you, or working things out for themselves can all help develop important life skills. These exercises won't solve every separation-related problem on their own, but they can become valuable foundations to build on as part of an individual training plan. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take from this video is that separation-related behaviours aren't all the same. Before trying to change behaviour, spend time or get somebody in to understand why it's happening. Once you understand the dog in front of you, you're much more likely to choose the right training plan for them. And I hope you have enjoyed this 2-part series on separation-related behaviours.